Welcome to Edison's new series, Real Assets in an Uncertain World. Now, we live in an era of increasing geopolitical instability, higher inflation and tightening monetary policy. Can investing in real assets provide sustainable, less correlated returns? Industry leaders from sectors such as renewables, infrastructure, media and technology are joining us to reveal their views and deliver actionable insights for a global audience. In this session, we're going to hear from Seraphim, the global leader in space tech investment. And with me is James Bruegger, Chief Investment Officer. Hello, James.
Hi, Vivienne. Delighted to be with you here today.
Now, what does Seraphim invest in? Obviously, space, but what's interesting about it and how do you do it versus the competition?
So we're the most prolific investor in space globally, and as a consequence of that, that means that we've actually invested in pretty much all facets of the space sector. Space technology is really at the heart of many elements of our day-to-day lives in the modern world in ways that we don't even think about it, be that GPS and satellite communications and all of the data that's coming down from space. So we invest in all aspects of the ecosystem, but with a particular focus around people that are putting up very small, low-cost, miniaturized satellites made out of the same componentry that goes into your mobile phone, that you're now seeing people putting up satellites that are as small as that, may cost tens of thousands of dollars and are putting up thousands of them. That is a really profound shift that is really what is driving huge amounts of innovation. So that is our core area of focus, but we've invested in everything from space taxis, believe it or not, to antenna technology, to artificial intelligence technology that's doing interesting things with all of the data that's coming down. But predominantly, I think the core area of our focus is these emerging new space satellite constellations.
So here, the assets are all these constellations of small satellites, and are we talking kind of shoebox size, something like that?
Indeed. So we look at this and articulate it as an emerging new digital infrastructure in the sky. So you're absolutely right. These are physical assets, but the reason that we've invested in them is not so much because of the hardware, it's about the data and connectivity that they're delivering. So just to put this in context, there is a forthcoming data and connectivity tsunami that's coming from all of these satellites. The whole world is going to be blanketed in high-speed internet connectivity everywhere. So think about nearly the 50% of the world's population who today can't get online reliably. This sort of connectivity is going to change their lives for the better, bringing billions of people into the digital economy. Likewise, all of the data that's being generated, being able to capture in real time minute changes, but at global scale that are happening. That has applications in everything from combating climate change to dealing with the current crisis that we all face as a consequence of Ukraine.
Because I was going to ask, why is this so interesting now? And I guess some people think of space and they think of, you know, the kind of all the movies that they've seen, but actually suddenly this has reached a maturity that perhaps people don't realize.
I think that's certainly true. I mean, historically, if you're looking at specifically satellites, people putting up satellites, they were the size of a bus. They cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds. And as a consequence, you didn't put up very many of them. Now, by contrast, for the cost of one of those satellites, the kind of companies we're investing in are able to launch hundreds or even thousands of satellites. And again, just to sort of provide some more context around how this has changed, in the entire history of the space age, so since Sputnik first went up in 1957, there's been somewhere in the region of 13,000 satellites that have ever been launched. And more than 25% of those have been put up in the last 3 years by 4 companies. Now, what we're focused on is the 200 plus other companies that are emerging that over the next 10 years have plans to put up in excess of 100,000 satellites. So again, just to think about that, nearly 10 times the amount of satellites that have ever been launched in the 65 plus years that we've been spacefaring humanity, 10 times that being done by private companies in a handful of next years. That is really going to drive very, very profound change. And we believe it's going to be profound change that is going to define society in forthcoming decades. It's going to be the data and connectivity that powers autonomous cars, flying cars, drone deliveries, robotics, amongst many other things that are really going to change all of our daily lives, we think, for the better.
Now, what's needed to make investing in space-related technologies more mainstream? Because we think of it as being the preserve of billionaires and like Elon Musk, available to a wider set of investors.
Well, I think it's first worth just in terms of those billionaires, why have they been investing very significant amounts, billions of dollars of their own money into space? I think it's for a combination of two reasons. One, they've recognized the very significant changes that I've been talking about, the fact that it is now 100 times cheaper to launch something into space than it was once before, through the cost of launch coming down and miniaturization of satellites, but also the scale of the opportunity. We're talking about potentially trillions of dollars of value that is going to be created in the relative near term. So I think it's inevitable that following the lead of those trailblazers, that there is broader interest. We've seen that over the last 5 years in terms of the venture capital community, where you've seen very considerable amounts of money, year on year, record levels being plowed into the sector. To put it in context, last year, somewhere in the region of about £10 billion was invested into several hundred private companies around the world. However, most of the investors that are doing that are generalist investors. They might have one or two space investments in a portfolio of lots of other areas. And what's different about Seraphim is that we're obviously a dedicated space investor. We're the first venture fund globally to focus on this category. We launched our first fund in 2016, and then we IPO'd on the stock market. So I think both in terms of public market investors, there's increasing opportunities to get exposure to this category by investing into the likes of Seraphim or in companies that have IPO'd, and likewise in the private domain through the multitude of different funds that are investing. I think there's increasing opportunity and appetite for people to invest in this exciting area.
Now, exchange traded funds are ubiquitous in investment. Can they offer a solution for investors in this area?
I think, of course they can, and different approaches have different merits. But I think the key point that I'd stress in the context of exchange traded funds is that by and large, what they're able to invest in is well-established incumbent companies, rather than necessarily the newly emerging, disruptive, innovative companies that are still private. So it's really these private companies that we see as driving some of the really radical changes that I've talked about. And I think to date, at least, it's relatively difficult to get exposure to those through exchange traded funds, simply because not that many of those businesses have yet become public themselves.
Am I right in saying that you see something extraordinary, like 70% of all the startups in this area?
Yes, that's correct. We found ourselves in a very fortunate position of having been an early pioneer ourselves in this market, having raised our first fund in 2016. So we built a very strong global profile. We have a very strong network with leading corporates in the sector, and some of the most successful entrepreneurs that have built their own businesses to billions of dollars of outcome. And what that has translated into is that on any given month, we're seeing hundreds of opportunities that translates into somewhere in the region of 70 to 80% of all of the investment activity that's happening has come across our door at some point.
So to conclude, that really the key question here is, can a portfolio of space tech assets provide investors with good returns in a rising interest rate environment?
I think the ability to make returns in the current environment that we find ourselves in is obviously one of the key topics for investors in all categories at the moment. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, so it's hard to know how things are going to pan out. But I think in a scenario of rising interest rates and crucially significant inflation, investors are still going to need to find growth for their investments, because otherwise in real terms they're going to be losing money. So I actually think that in the context of focusing on high growth potential businesses that are very aligned with some of the big challenges that we as a world face right now, the role that space has to play in combating climate change, the role that space is playing day to day currently in terms of supporting efforts to combat Russian aggression in Ukraine, and actually hold the Russians accountable for what they've done. For a combination of those reasons, I think space has never been more relevant than it is right now. And I think it represents for long-term patient capital investors a fantastic opportunity to grow as the sector does.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to talk to you about space. It's always such a fascinating subject. Thank you so much, James.
Vivienne, thank you very much. My pleasure.